Alright, today is a beautiful day for science. Currently looking at region 3110, which has had a large amount of activity due to the fact of having its arrangement of loops covering a gap area of two coronal holes, which technically is one being divided by the leading umbra of the region 3110. So we can see here that what happens is the coronal winds, or the corona solar wind particles, create so much pressure that it disrupts the way the loops are arranged and forces them to break from crossing over its path and causes them to divert themselves over the region, causing even more disruption, which actually in the end disrupts the entire umbra itself, causing an escalation up to the X1 we had the other day. So we can see here, this is region 3110. This right here is the leading umbra. It's really large, actually this whole area right here. And we have loops that are crossing over this in this area, right in the center. And you can even see some of the lingering brighter ones that, as they reach that way, they don't show as well on 131 angstrom, but we'll see it better on 171. So while we see the following area have a lot of activity, it isn't until the leading umbra is disrupted by the coronal hole forcing its way to release its solar particles that we see this disruption escalate, and we get a series of M classes and that X1. Now, the significance of that disruption to the umbra also caused a significant disruption to the surface of the sun. So we had a lot of activity coming from the photosphere, the chromosphere, and then the corona, which included also there being a proton event, a couple of them. And in those proton events, fortunately, they focused more towards the northward portion, so we did not see much of that activity, but we did see slight variations on the proton flux. But this tells us that the majority of the plasma from the coronal mass ejections most likely are going to be missing Earth as well, although we are starting to see some inclination of solar activity from the glancing blows that they have been providing us. So these events do have a minor impact on us, but not too significant, nothing to be concerned about for sure. Yeah, these are high-res images. They took it took 3 days to set this up to be able to show this accurately in the 8K imagery that was provided. And that way I can zoom in and it would maintain its high resolution. But as you see in these bursts, you see that large amount of plasma go northward. Now, this does still spread out, especially with those coronal winds, keeping it from spreading as much towards the west. It does still spread out more to the northward portion, which means that even though we're impacted, the large mass of plasma from the continued eruptions there, we're only seeing a very minor display of that when it comes to what we see. But here especially is where we can see it very clearly. Now, this right here is the umbra. That right there, that is a very large umbra. And you can see how it has completely separated this coronal hole that goes up almost to the north, which usually when it's connected that far, it's providing an even stronger amount of solar winds, solar particles, due to connectivity and energy. And this right here is the very reason why I said when I first saw this, recently did some research, and I saw that this exact thing is one of the things to look for, and this is it. So it was beautiful timing, and we can see as that disruption begins, we start to see those loops and some flaring occur on that leading edge, and you'll see that it's actually going across the umbra, and that is because it keeps getting pushed from the corona, from ahead of the region, and it's trying to force those loops back over the region, and then you'll see those loops finally form as it has no choice, as it's just completely disrupted and forced out of the way. Now this is the Angstrom 193 filter. This shows us the deeper coronal holes. So in the next one, 211 angstrom, we'll see the coronal hole in its full size, because it'll include the shallow and deep coronal holes. And in this, you can see that it is truly indeed connected all the way up. And this one wraps around as well, but not as intense, but more so the northern portion definitely played a contributor to this, forcing that entire region, the entire sunspot that's leading this had to be disrupted. And it did. It disparaged that entire umbra to the point where it's now broken into many different umbras, and that region has been reorganizing since then. You can see how quickly these loops are growing as well. So imagine that these new loops being pushed over there, trying to find a new footing, and in doing so they disrupt the way that the region was orientated on the following. And as that happens, we see initially the northern portion take impact because it has some higher loops that took that collision. And this is due to material from here, these loops, being pushed around to over here to connect to these in this area. So when that happened, that's when we get our larger significant flares. Oh, I slipped a 94 angstrom filter or image in there. Yeah, my computer did not want to make this video because how large it was. It took 58 gigabytes of RAM to develop this video. But you see right there all that darker shading. Never mind the green 94 angstrom images coming in there periodically, but you'll see the shading. That's the plasma that's being dispersed as a CME, and it has most of a westward push, but it's not going as far westward as it looks because of those coronal holes. It's going to keep it from pushing as far west as it would otherwise. So what we're going to have is it not go as far west as originally you would think, as it were. But yeah, additionally, aside from 3110, which has been spectacular, we have 3112, which has had a lot of well, excellent activity as well, but its activity is not necessarily associated with something so spectacular itself. This is just your average run-of-the-mill high potential region. And this activity has been quite beautiful as well, although it has not lived up to its potential just yet. We're seeing a lot of restructuring and rearranging, but the activity seems to be more isolated when it starts to do so. We haven't seen something that impacts the region in one fell swoop. at least not yet. But indeed, as you see here, we have a lot of overlying flares that occur with some of the larger loops. We have some smaller flares that occur with some of the smaller loops. But you don't see anything that connects a flare that disrupts this entire region. And due to this being more isolated in different parts, this is one of the reasons why it has not been as significant otherwise, as well as there's been nothing that has caused a disruption to the actual surface in the way that we've seen for 3110. In seeing this activity in 3112, we do have a notion that this progression towards the solar maximum is going quite well. We're going to see more and more of this activity, and it's going to continue more towards the equator until we get to more equatorial regions. And I believe we even seen one coming around the corner in the next couple of days. Take a look again when we look at the stereo ahead post, looking at this region right here. But looking at Angstrom 171 really tells the story for 3112, and that is a lot of loops that are actually somewhat organized, strangely enough, and yet still flaring due to the amount of electromagnetic buoyancy that's causing these loops to grow into one another and having a bunch of accidental high fives. So we see that these loops have a quick progression, and that's when we see the flare, when it runs out of space and runs into another one, and you get a bunch of little curvatures, and loops don't like to bend. They'll curve, they'll do twists and all kinds of stuff, but if you make them bend, they'll flare up. And you can see right here, a lot of loops, a lot of smoothness, some feeding from all the way over here, and that's why we get some of the activity over here. And then right here you can see very clearly these loops are all very organized. They just keep growing into one another very quickly. And that's due to how much energy is coming up through the surface. Now, normally when I look for a high potential area, I look for loops that are going different directions. There's an arrangement where these loops don't seem to organize and they have conflict with one another. And in doing so, they just in general end up being spaghetti, and they don't fit in the plate unless they run into each other. In this case, it's more the potentials due to what's happening under the surface, where it's growing up, the potential of the energy pushing upward, and that's causing the flaring and activity we're seeing from 3112 at current. whenever you see a region that has activity in the nature of 3112, you see that these loops are growing quickly and they're escalating their reach and altitude. A lot of times that is because the activity there underneath the surface is coiled so much with that electromagnetic buoyancy, the energy from these magnetic field lines. They're so pushed apart from one another because they're so clustered that they have nowhere to go but through the surface. And typically you see that in a region that is growing. And typically those kind of regions that are growing do become more complicated because they're coming out wherever they can. So it's not a restructuring region, it's a region that's expanding in some nature, whether within its own region, isolated area, or expanding outward to become larger in general. And with this region here, it seems to be actually having a lot of interconnectivity where that polarization seems to be mixing. So we're seeing a lot of activity that may later escalate to more of the loops I was talking about where they crisscross. But as of current, that has not fully progressed yet. We're still seeing a lot of straightforward loops and just quick accelerated growth. And as long as that continues and it can maintain that, this region will never expand too much more. Well, not never. There's no absolutes in science, but most likely will not. And what tells the story of that best is going to be at 304, where we're going to see the overlying plasma and how it's actually not a contributor to the activity here. It's been pushed aside. We're going to see that in just a moment as soon as 211 has run its cycle. Alright, here we go. We'll see that a lot of the plasma has actually been pushed to the side. A lot of this darker plasma is around the region. This is due to the upswelling of the activity pushing the plasma to the side from the surface. And we'll see that not as much is running through it. And so due to that as well, there's less to disrupt the activity of that growth. And once again, ignore the 94 angstrom images that seem to have found their way in into this as well. But here we go. And you can see it's very, very organized, very active, but very, very organized. And the more notably, the plasma feeding into it from with the outer area is not really causing a complete disruption otherwise, and that's because it is more organized, so it has a pinpointed area that's not disrupting a somewhat unstable area to begin with. If that plasma was flowing in from outward into the area and there was a mix, it would be anyone's guess, but a good chance that it would cause a disruption and we would see destabilization of those loops in the arrangement that they were. But as you see, there's not much in heavy plasma within the region because it's all been pushed to the side. And we have these hot loops that are showing up very nicely, even on 304. And just to end it up, take a look at the last active little area here, and yeah. But in all, very beautiful activity. 3112 is a unique yet not unusual event overall. It's still very beautiful to see, and one of the best chances to be able to see a larger size flare. And 3110 still has a lot of potential. It currently has not lived up to its potential, but we've seen a lot of that this this cycle of the solar activity anyways, which is fine. But yeah, in all, very beautiful activity. Just wanted to cover the past week because it's been a kind of a unique situation, a very good thing to observe, and explains a lot of what to look for and why when people say they expect a certain activity to happen, why they expect it, what that means, and what kind of activity is really expected. When they say a proton event, why there's a proton event? Because the surface is disrupted and it's causing plasma from the photosphere to actually be dispersed as part of the CME projection. And when you see other activity such as a continually firing CME progression, it's due to that same thing as well, which is why we saw so many M classes and X class, and then a rapid fire C class from 3110 as well. So I'll let this video run, and that's the end of the update. Cheers and science on.